Welcome to Nerds at Church, a podcast about nerdery and the Bible. I'm Pastor Emily, and I use pronouns like they, them, theirs.
And I'm Pastor Kay, and my pronouns are she, her. In this episode, we'll discuss the 8th Sunday after Pentecost, also known as Lectionary 16 or Proper 11, which this year falls on July 23rd.
Check out the episode description for links to the Bible passages and other references we make in this episode.
So, for our deep dive this week, because of our readings, we are focusing on agriculture. And while last week we focused on gardening, this week we are talking more about Big Ag, the industrial farming complex of America. And we are focusing on agriculture in America because that's what we know. So we're not going to be talking about agriculture elsewhere in the world today so much.
For the most part.
Yeah.
So to start out with a very, very brief history of kind of colonial agricultural history and kind of make some of the initial connections to colonization for us. And we have links to almost everything we're talking about, so we'll include those in the episode description if you want to know more about any of kind of the big topics that we're talking about. So in the initial colonization of this land, of what is known as Turtle Island or the Americas, the colonizers who came in, Christopher Columbus and all of them, had these ideas of what food was considered the right kind of food and what food was considered the wrong kind of food. Mostly they had an idea that their kind of food was the right kind of food. And so there was a kind of collision at that point where they looked at indigenous food and food sources and said that and decided that they were the wrong kind of foods, that they were not healthy, that they were not good for you. And that is a conflict and with power in particular places that continues today, all the way through the ways that like soul food and indigenous foods are looked down on as unhealthy versus like white foods or European foods. Weight loss programs continue this. There is the right kind of food, there is the wrong kind of food. All of that stuff plays out as a result of colonization and white supremacy in foods. And one of the shifts that happened between indigenous communities pre-Columbus and post-Columbus is indigenous communities ate, for the most part, their meat source was wild animals, and they had some domesticated animals, but not a ton. They really didn't use animals for labor, except for occasionally some dogs. And colonizers introduced a lot of what is known as livestock, like contemporary livestock, cows, horses, pigs, sheep, goats, some dogs, etc., that basically took over and decimated indigenous crops and indigenous plant cultivation. And that is what prompted a lot of the shift into what we now experience, some in the US, a lot globally, as like cash crop and raw material production for export. And that's a lot of what official colonies and colonization was taking the resources and raw materials from people and bringing that to predominantly European, though now the US also is a colonial power, for their use and their increasing wealth. And so that's like when we talk about a lot of countries in Africa in particular, when we talk about, like, people use different words. Some use third world countries, some use developing countries, some use formerly colonized countries. The essence that holds them all together is that their resources have been exploited and extracted by other countries to increase the wealth of other countries, putting them in a situation where they do not have the same wealth on a global scale, and so they are not able to provide for people in the same way, and they get trapped in vicious cycles of debt and like capitalism. But all of that kind of plays out because of this colonial structure of getting resources from particular communities and giving them to other people and other powerful people, like royalty.
Yeah. So what does the agricultural situation in America look like right now? Well, for some initial context, the three biggest crops grown in the USA today are corn, soybeans, and wheat. Corn and soybeans are usually alternated. You grow corn in a field one year and then you grow soybeans the next year because they do a really good job in preparing the soil of that field for the other crop by replacing some nutrients and taking away nutrients that aren't needed by the other crop.
Which I think we talked about a little bit last week in our last episode with Aaron for like local growing things.
Yeah. Whereas to my knowledge, wheat does not so much have a single partner like that works quite as well as corn and soybeans do. Corn mostly goes to livestock feed and also ethanol as a fuel additive. Corn for human consumption is actually a relatively minor part of the crop, and that tends to surprise people. Sweet corn is not a huge part of the corn that is grown in America.
Yeah.
Soybeans are used as both meal and as oil. The ground soybeans create what's called a meal, and that mostly goes to livestock feed because it has a number of vitamins and nutrients that aren't included in other major grains. And the oil is mostly for human consumption. You can find soybean oil in practically anything in your grocery store.
Yeah, just like corn.
Yeah. And then finally, the wheat primarily goes to feeding humans for the most part. The U.S. is the world's largest producer of corn and soybeans and one of the largest producers of wheat. I think we used to be the largest producer of wheat, but more recently, other countries have increased their wheat production. Our corn exports, sending corn to other countries, that's increasing overall over the last several years. And our wheat exports have been decreasing overall in a similar way, again, because of those other markets coming into play. The soybeans, I think, are mostly holding steady. I couldn't really find any solid info on them the same way that I could for the corn and the wheat.
Yeah.
It's kind of weird how soybeans tend to get ignored when people talk about big ag because everyone wants to talk about corn and wheat instead, despite the fact that they are actually one of the three major crops. You don't find as much info on soybeans compared
to... Well, and I think when people say corn, they think they know what they're talking about because they think sweet corn. And so I think that's part of it, that corn just is more recognizable and there's more, maybe even bias against soybeans because it's soy and the food that it is associated with
tofu.
Yeah, is tofu. And so not something that like dominant white culture is going to lift up or value.
And for those who are interested, one of the reasons why sweet corn is less a major part of the crop is because it's so labor intensive. I went to high school in DeKalb, Illinois, and one of the very common jobs for teenagers in DeKalb was detasseling. When I first moved to DeKalb, I had to have someone repeat that word to me 3 or 4 times because I didn't think I had heard them correctly because I had no idea what they were talking about. But detasseling is when you have people, ordinary human beings, usually teenagers in that area, walk through the cornfield and pull the corn silk off of individual corn cobs on the corn stalks. And once they don't have corn silk on them anymore, they can't pick up the pollen, which will allow the corn to turn from sweet corn into maize, the stuff that you make corn meal out of, or ethanol. So that's how you make sweet corn. And in DeKalb and in many other places, because it is such a short-term job, you really only have a few weeks to do it in, and it's not something that migrant workers can usually take on because of just how very quick this is. They usually wind up hiring teenagers, and it's widely known as one of the most miserable but best-paying summer jobs you can get because you basically spend 6 to 8 hours out in the field. You have to wear long pants and long sleeves because otherwise the corn stalks will cut you up pretty badly, and just in absolutely miserable heat pulling tassels off of corn.
But then they pay you well. Yeah.
Yes, usually. And so speaking of detasseling versus many other jobs around farms, there are different kinds of farms in the United States, and we realize that not all of our listeners will have spent much time in rural America, so we thought we would outline what we tend to think of as the 3 major types of farms. So the first type is the one that I grew up knowing the most about because they are all over the place in the Midwest, which is to say farms that mostly focus on crops and specifically on corn or soybeans or wheat. And these types of farms that are focused on corn, soybeans, or wheat are largely found in the Midwest, and these don't really need a ton of farm workers because of the role that technology and large machinery now plays in farming those particular 3 crops.
Which we'll get into more.
Yeah.
Another type of farm is a mostly livestock farm. So there are a few different ways that this happens. One is cattle, which again doesn't require as much people support because for the most part you want your cattle to graze when it is possible, and so it's bigger. This is the one that I was the most connected to growing up because Greeley, Colorado has a large cattle population.
And those are also called cattle ranches.
Yeah, and that was like people would say, oh, Greeley smells like cow poop, and then other people would say, no, Greeley smells like money, right? Because that was the economy, that was the income.
The standard joke is manure smells like money.
Yeah.
Except for chicken manure, which actually smells the worst, but yeah.
Oh, interesting. Good to know.
Oh, I've always been told that.
Okay. The other types of kind of livestock farms that are pretty popular in the Midwest in particular are hog farms and dairy farms. And both hog farms and dairy farms require more farm workers than like a family plus one or two. And so the hog farms, one of the interesting things in Iowa in particular is there are laws that cap the size of a hog farm, and above that it becomes the big farm, and so the regulations change. And so for the most part, hog farms are like one or two below that. So they do the letter of the law and not the spirit of the law, which a lot of communities then are negatively impacted because there's a lot of waste runoff and a lot of smell and all of that sort of thing.
However, I will say that if you're at a rural county fair and you're looking for a good meal, go find yourself the pork producers setup. And they are almost always selling really amazing sandwiches, as long as you can eat pork. So that is one of my favorite visits every county fair.
Did not think about that. I mean, vegetarian.
Well, you're a vegetarian, yes.
Yeah. The other type of livestock farm is a dairy farm, and those do usually employ farm workers because the cycles for milking, like there's just like, it's basically a 24-hour operation in many senses. And so a lot of even like what we would consider quote unquote family farms are employing, for any of the livestock farms, for the most part, they employ a lot of farm workers who are not from the family. And so a lot of immigrant farm workers are employed in that respect year round for livestock because livestock are alive all year round.
Yeah. Well, dairy livestock are.
Well, true. But the others like have to reproduce and stuff. So there's a little bit. But one of the things to note is that anytime we're talking about immigrant farm workers, there is the possibility and likelihood of exploitation. And that comes for livestock farm workers and then also for the other type of farm, which is mostly crops, but mostly non-corn, soybean, wheat crops. So mostly vegetables and fruits and like everything except them. So those are more prolific in California and in the South. And those require a ton of farm workers because you're gathering produce for people to eat. And that just is a trickier thing. It is a more delicate thing, all of that. And what I think is important to know about when we have farm workers is both like it is way more likely that they are not being paid just or generous wage, that there's exploitation that can happen a lot. There are also visas that are given for, like, when I was in Minnesota, I worked with farm workers who were there year round working on dairy farms, but I also worked with farm workers who came seasonally just to do the vegetable crops and those sorts of things, and they came on visas. So there's a lot of different ways that people can come, and both of those ways can involve exploitation. The laws that we have around labor rights and those sorts of things frequently exclude farms under the premise that farms are family farms, but the reality is that it makes it easier to exploit. And so like the United Farm Workers and other organizing groups have a lot harder time organizing and getting more rights. And so that's just like something to note when we have like E. coli outbreaks on plants. Probably what is happening is that workers are being exploited and not given bathroom breaks and those sorts of things that they need throughout the day. Right. So it is very complicated, and high propensity for exploitation, and you can do it well. You can do it without all of that exploitation, but it costs money. So also, there are tons of farmers who might do one particular type, whether it's livestock or corn, soybeans, wheat in particular, and will have a little bit of something else just for the family or the neighbors. So like a crop farm might have a couple of milk cows or a dozen chickens, or kids might have some animals for 4-H, but that's not their major business. That's just like a smaller family setup. It makes it really great to get fresh eggs. I know when I was in Minnesota, I really enjoyed fresh. I think I paid $2 a dozen for delivery to my home of farm fresh eggs.
Nice. The price has since risen to $4 a dozen, but they're still very good.
Yeah, but especially if you're like not buying commercial eggs, because that's a whole other, we're not even getting into chicken. And just about everybody grows some sort of vegetables or fruits for their own consumption. It just makes sense, but also like that's just like pretty typical. I had to be careful during like zucchini season and some of those things, because sometimes people will just put vegetables or fruit in a car if it's left unlocked or on the porch. Yes. But zucchini, you can shred zucchini and freeze it well. So zucchini bread in the winter. Just saying. Take all the zucchini.
Yeah, moving to a rural area and not having a chest freezer is kind of a gamble. Not so much because you might, buy a quarter of a cow or something, although that's always a useful idea if you're not vegetarian, but mostly because the sheer amount of vegetables that will be forced on you, not, violently, but rather through social peer pressure, will amaze you if you haven't done that. The end of summer and beginning of fall are a very dangerous time for that. And speaking of which, there was definitely a story that I meant to share last week when we were talking about gardening that I think just didn't quite make the list because we were having so much fun talking with Erin. But I have about 3 standard Tumblr posts that I really love to share with people under various circumstances, and this is one of them. It's the Tumblr Squish post. If you don't know what I'm talking about, please go to this link, and you have to go through some initial conversation about what rural life is like in America, and also, people breaking into your cars to leave vegetables there to get to the Squish story, which is partway down, but all of it is absolutely worth it. And if you want to know what rural life is like, it's a decent introduction. But Squish is apparently what happens when you accidentally alternate zucchini and squash in your garden.
Like yellow squash, I'm assuming?
Yes, it was summer squash. So yeah, alternating zucchini and summer squash in your garden. And the two cross-pollinate and created Squish, which was enormous and took over their lives for a year. And after that, the parents of this family refused to ever plant both plants in their garden at the same time ever again. It's really very extraordinary and totally worth it. Also, some adult language in that post, just for those who need to know that in advance. Maybe don't read it at work.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, it is a good time.
I love zucchini bread, so I'm like partial to like, if you have extra zucchini, just give it to me. I don't know anybody around here in Baltimore who grows stuff besides our household, which is growing basil and jalapenos and carrots and strawberries, maybe? I don't know. Lots of things with fun names. Yeah, but definitely consent around giving people zucchini in particular. So then we get into what is the agriculture scene today. And agriculture in this country is managed by the United States Department of Agriculture. So creatively named, but also it's nice when things have clear and understandable names. And you can definitely find out more about how they work on their website. There's a lot of stuff with the Department of Agriculture. Also, there's some overlap with the Food and Drug Administration because of food, which is part of agriculture. Yeah. And one of the big things that is sometimes talked about, but not a ton, is agricultural subsidies. And that's one of the big ways that farms function in this country these days.
And as Emily goes into their rant about agricultural subsidies, which is totally earned, I will point out that we will have a link in our episode description which will allow you to, if you know people who have farms, agricultural subsidies are public information. You can look up your neighbors and see how much money they've taken for subsidies. And to be fair, some subsidies are perfectly reasonable. Some farms do not abuse this by any means. But there are a bunch of farms out there who have taken a lot of money in agricultural subsidies and might also at the same time be complaining about people on welfare. And if that's your neighbor, then maybe having that information at your fingertips would be useful the next time you bump into them at church. Not that I'm speaking from personal experience at all whatsoever. I would never. So that might be helpful for you.
Also, it might be helpful for your senator or representative or state legislators.
Yeah, that's also true.
Who also complain, similar to those who received PPP loans and complained about student loan debt forgiveness.
Yeah.
Not that that is likely to change behavior, because clearly we've digressed a lot in our country government. Anyway, so agricultural subsidies, also called the agricultural incentive, but most people know them as subsidies, are a government incentive that's paid to agribusinesses. So it's not just family farms, it's farms writ large. So agricultural organizations and farms to supplement their income and to kind of manage or regulate the supply of agricultural commodities and influence the cost and supply of such commodities. So the English corn laws were one of the first times that this happened, and they regulated Great Britain and Ireland for centuries until they were repealed in 1846. And then agricultural subsidies in the 20th century, so last century, which still feels weird to say, even 23 years in, were actually originally designed to stabilize markets and help low-income farmers and aid rural development, especially during the Great Depression. And what's interesting about it is that the plan was to increase prices for a range of agricultural products by paying farmers to destroy some of their livestock or to not use some of their land, known as land idling, which is actually also a good thing for land. It's very biblical, right? We get the idea of Jubilee, that every 7 years you let your land lie fallow and whatever grows, grows, and that is what you use or eat. But part of that is it gives space for land to renew, for the nutrients in the soil to replenish, those sorts of things. Some of that is mitigated by cover crops. So people will plant stuff with big leaves to keep the dirt in, but then also the soybean, corn, back and forth helps replenish a lot of the nutrients, but not all of them. And the land idling, getting paid to land idle, led to a reduction in the supply and smaller agricultural surpluses, which meant that the amount charged for them could be increased. And the initial products that fell under that were corn, wheat, cotton, rice, peanuts, tobacco, and milk. But what is particularly interesting, I think, in agricultural subsidies is that there are a significant number of farmers who, the only way that they actually earn money from farming is from the subsidies. They don't necessarily earn money from the sale of the crops because it costs more to produce the crops than they'll earn. And so the subsidies really do heavily influence what people plant.
Yes.
And how they go about it, because that's the way that they get money, which is in and of itself a problematic kind of cycle of things. And the movement towards more organic food crops, so crops grown for food for humans as opposed to livestock or ethanol or those sorts of things, pushes against that some. So people are frequently more willing to pay more, or it's local. And so you can do, our family is doing a CSA, community supported agriculture, where we pay money.
Sure.
We did it upfront, but there was also the option of weekly. And then for 13 weeks, we get a bag of produce delivered to our house every Thursday. And it's delightful.
No matter whether you've used the stuff from last week or not. I've done a CSA or two myself.
Also true. I figured in a house of 5 adults, we have a pretty good shot of actually using this stuff. And our CSA is different from most in that we get to pick which things we want, as opposed to...
Oh, that's very helpful.
Yeah, it's helpful particularly for our house, but...
Yeah. I would say for anyone considering a CSA, if you haven't done one before, buy the smaller share than what you initially want to for your first year. And thank me later.
Yep. Yeah, it's definitely like a smaller to like get into it is helpful. But when
Right.
I had a CSA in Minnesota, I had the smaller share, but a smaller share is meant for two people and I was single. And so I canned
Right.
a lot of tomatoes. I did a lot of preserving of stuff that was
We
really
learned to love
helpful.
kohlrabi, which was pretty cool.
Yeah. Yep. And that, like, making sure you have the time to do those things. So I'm excited because I'm
Yep.
on sabbatical right now. So I actually, like, will have the time to just cook up all of the squash that has been piling
Sure.
up or those sorts of things. So, but yeah, it takes some effort, but it's also a way to support local stuff. You know where it's coming from a lot of the times. You can know if it's organic or not, all of that stuff. And it keeps the economy local instead of in like the giant corporations that we also frequently support because limited resources. Yeah.
Right.
And one of the things that we have talked about a little bit, but not a ton, is having diversified crops. So one of the dangers of monoculture farming is that it increases the likelihood that a single pest or a blight could wipe out large amounts of crop. So, for example, in 1970, the corn blight wiped out 15% of the US's corn crop because so many people had planted the exact same high yield plants. And right now, bananas, for the most part, there's one type of banana. There used to be others. Yeah. So all of those like fake banana flavors that you taste actually come from a different strain of banana that is just not produced anymore.
Well, it is, I think, but only in a couple isolated places. I think you can still get them from the Philippines, if I'm remembering correctly. Okay. I don't remember what that one is called. The one we eat now is called the Cavendish.
Yeah.
And so if you read Captain America fan fiction from Marvel, there are a decent number of Captain America fanfics that will mention that Steve and then later Bucky are deeply confused by the taste of modern bananas because they are not like what they're used to at all, because the banana blight happened after World War II. And so that is frequently hilarious. And one of my favorite ones, which I don't remember the name of off the top of my head, included Bucky tweeting through his Twitter account, "Bananas are wrong. America, why?" And that was just deeply amusing.
Yeah. So. And now there's like potential problems with the bananas that we have now because it's, again, not diversified. And so there are, I think it's pests, but I'm not 100% positive, but like there's,
I believe so.
There's stuff damaging those bananas. And so the alternative to monoculture farming is permaculture farming, which involves more variety of crops. And one of the things to just note here is when we look at farms, when you drive across the country and see farms, for the most part, you see rows and rows and rows of the same crops. One of the things that we talked about a little bit last week is the three sisters, but like the idea of growing different plants connected to each other, like in the same area. So corn, beans, and squash work really well together because they support each other and they kind of balance each other out. But there are also ways that you can do that that can help protect crops. So having something that will take care of aphids is a good thing to protect aphids who would, you know, eat the carrot leaves or those sorts of things that you can intentionally plant, not just a diversity of crops to avoid blight or pest wiping out everything, but also a diversity of crops to help protect each other instead of just relying on something like Roundup or other pesticides that we will talk about in a minute.
Yeah. However, permaculture farming does generally involve a much smaller profit margin and a lot more planning ahead and actual like physical labor, which can make it more difficult.
Yeah. But again, part of that income, right, depends on subsidies. So what is the difference between monoculture and permaculture farming without the subsidies? That's always the question.
Right.
If we didn't have oil subsidies, would it actually be cheaper to do oil versus renewable resources? If we didn't have agriculture subsidies for corn, soybeans, and wheat, would it actually be more cost effective to grow those crops? Or would we have more diversity of crops?
And speaking of those questions, there is often a conversation when we talk about agriculture in America about family farms versus corporate farms. And this is really based on something of a misconception. Family farms the standard idyllic picture from usually the 1950s or earlier of a small family farm where just the family works and the kids have their chores and everybody wears overalls and carries around pitchforks. And corporate farms bring to mind, soulless businesses that own farms and employ workers, and there's no ownership or indeed anyone living on the farm anymore. That's not really so much how it works these days.
Mm-hmm.
There are hobby farms, which is to say farms that are, say, like 15 acres or less that are owned by families, and that's literally a hobby and often loses money every year, frankly. It is really hard to have a profitable hobby farm.
That's why it's called hobby.
Yeah. But for the most part, family farms have, generally speaking, incorporated as businesses around the country, and they also tend to be much larger today than they were even 50 years ago. Overall, we have fewer farmers today, and when I say farmers, I'm not talking about farm workers, I'm talking about people who own and operate their farms.
Mm-hmm.
We have fewer farmers today than we ever have had before, partly due to technology lessening the need for farm workers, particularly on corn, soybean, and wheat farms, and partly due to the number of farmers who have either freely chosen or been financially forced to sell off their land and leave farming and go into other areas. Usually, they sell that land to a neighbor, and it's usually due either to repeated bad seasons, just bad crop years over and over again, or actual money mismanagement. And they're never going to actually tell you if it was money mismanagement, but that doesn't mean that doesn't happen. We have all heard those stories when we've lived in a rural area long enough, once you gain trust. But also, another reason we have fewer farmers now is because it is so hard to start out as a farmer brand new to the business without having inherited the farm from family, due to the enormous amount of money you need to start between buying your land and buying the, frankly, extraordinary amount of equipment that you actually need to be a profitable farmer today. So we don't have that many new farmers in the United States. Like the amount of loans you would have to take out to be a brand new farmer these days, especially since you would also, frankly, need a college education if you hadn't grown up being taught this stuff, is just extraordinary. People who don't live in rural areas don't understand that a combine, which is a 100% necessary piece of technology to have and is enormous, costs $750,000. And you, depending on what crops you're growing, you might be able to share a combine with one neighboring farm, but that's going to be about it because everybody needs to be using their combines at the same time.
Yeah.
So, and that's just one piece of equipment.
So that's also something that I think part of the misconception around farming is there is this idea that like farms are so rich and have so much money. Most of what shows up on like taxes and that sort of thing is property, right? Like it's not liquid assets. It's not money in the bank. It is millions of dollars invested in the land and in the equipment. And that's not stuff that you can't liquidate it because then you can't earn the money to like rebuy it or whatever. And so that's just like a misconception and impacts the estates and inheritance stuff because it is such a high amount, like the value is so high that after a certain value, when you're inheriting things, then you do start to get taxed. But if everything you're inheriting is land, then how do you afford the taxes on it?
Yes, unless you're renting out your land to your neighbors. But basically what we're saying is that the larger farms of today are, generally speaking, those family farms which have survived through multiple generations of other people selling off their land to the family farms that survive today. And also, another thing that this has led to is the depopulation of rural areas because we don't need farm workers the way for the corn, soybean, and wheat farms like we did a few generations ago because of the changes in technology and equipment. And also, most farms can't afford to grow anything but the most profitable crops. Like, there's a reason why so many places grow corn, soybeans, and wheat, or take subsidies to not grow them, because growing anything else would actually lose the money. And this has led to an extraordinary amount of monoculture farming across the United States, and that's why all of the cornfields you drive by look exactly the same. So, another controversy that has much more recently rocked the agricultural world is the John Deere right to repair lawsuit. To be clear, John Deere was the company being sued in this case by a group of farmers, and they were arguing for their right to repair their own John Deere equipment. John Deere had been forcing farmers to go to John Deere specific repair places and pay much higher amounts of money to repair their items because, frankly, a lot of farm equipment from John Deere and other companies is much more technological and computer-based than it used to be, and therefore they were able to make it more and more and more impossible for farmers to repair their own equipment.
This is also connected to, I know, Apple products. I have a laptop. I'm not allowed to do anything to it, or I forfeit any warranty or any of that stuff. And there's a little bit of room that's being made for like outsourcing that to certain people who can be trained and certified. But there's like the John Deere lawsuit is a particular thing for farmers, but also has a lot of potential repercussions for all of us who use technology, which is all of us. You can't listen to this podcast without using technology.
Yeah. Unless someone decides to pick up our podcast for the radio, which, hey, if you're interested, please do get in touch with us at nerdsetchurch@gmail.com.
Yes, for sure. We would love to be on the radio as well, which also is technology. But yes.
Well, yes, true. But, you know, that's at least the technology that was available back in the days when you actually could repair your own John Deere equipment at home.
True.
And so the lawsuit was won by the farmers, but many people remain skeptical about how this is going to work out in the long run, practically speaking, because, frankly, of how computer-based so much of the farm equipment is now. So we'll see how this goes. There were a ton of articles about this back in January. Yep. So I'm sure there will be more articles about it soon. And then the area of big ag that we have been throwing the most shade at and generally bringing up and taking potshots at for the last several episodes, I think, is agricultural biotechnology, which this is the process of using technology to change crops, change the seeds of the crops for various reasons. Sometimes you're increasing the yield. Sometimes you're protecting against blights. I brought up the dwarf wheat last episode, which both showed up in the Star Trek episode Trouble with Tribbles, and also there was a West Wing episode that I don't remember the name of offhand, where President Bartlett talked about the dwarf wheat briefly.
I learned about dwarf wheat because I went to Luther College.
Oh, okay. Yes, sure.
And in Des Moines, there's an actual, like, Dag Hammarskjöld. I'm pronouncing it terribly.
Oh, cool.
Like, food prize and food, like, thing that specifically came out of his work with dwarf wheat.
Yes. Yeah, I learned about it from Star Trek, so I don't get to have any, moral high horse in this situation. But this is called agricultural biotechnology, and there is a lot of big ag business, big ag profit that is based on this process. And related to that, you may have also noticed that we have taken a fair number of potshots at the company called Monsanto. Personally speaking, this is because I went to high school in DeKalb, Illinois, which is home of DeKalb Ag, which was bought out by Monsanto when I was in high school, and the town was furious about it. But also, this is because Monsanto has a bit of a reputation in big ag as just being the corporation that is best known, like certainly not the only corporation, but the corporation that is best known for just making smaller farmers and smaller agricultural businesses angry in various ways.
And our cafeteria system and our food service stuff in college got taken over right after I graduated by Monsanto / one of their subsidiary things. And so I know how the quality changed and like all of that stuff too.
Yeah. So Monsanto was originally a chemical manufacturer in 1901, and today it is invested in agricultural biotechnology and has made this company the largest seller of seeds in the world. Monsanto streamlines farm management, which is to say they make Roundup, which kills pests. It is a pesticide, and then they also make seeds that can withstand the pesticide Roundup. So if you get in with Monsanto at all, you will suddenly find yourself doing a lot more business with them than you might have expected initially.
Yeah, that's one of those, like, did they cause the problem so that they could solve it?
Yes. And, I'm not saying Monsanto has illegal business practices. I'm just saying that there's a difference between legal and moral.
I was going to say, I will say they have immoral.
Yes. And they have found those loopholes and specialized in finding those loopholes for a very long time now.
Mm-hmm.
They do claim to increase the crop yields through the seeds that they have altered in various ways. But on the other hand, they also lack evidence about those crop yield changes.
Yeah. So if you read Animal Vegetable Miracle by Barbara Kingsolver, there's a particular part in it that points this out that I'll talk about later in the deep dive. But there are a lot of people who talk about there is a claim that genetically modified seeds and crops will increase the yield, but again and again, organic farming practices produce abundant yields and frequently more abundant yields. So there is a claim, and it's one of those like, are we looking at investigative journalists or just regular journalists? Because at this point, regular journalists take what companies like Monsanto say about themselves and just repeat it instead of actually digging in to see if it's true.
Yeah. Monsanto is also legendarily aggressive with litigation. They've been winning a ton of lawsuits in the United States and Canada from 1997 to 2018, and they have not been quite as successful in Argentina and the European Union, which of course no longer includes the United Kingdom.
Mm-hmm. No. But part of why they're less successful in Argentina and the EU is that the EU and Argentina have stronger laws to protect farmers.
Right, and against monopolies. Yeah. And so Monsanto also makes Agent Orange. They make Roundup, which are in many legal controversies, really at any given time. Like, I think there's been at least one lawsuit against Roundup since I was in high school. So that was wild.
Well, and Roundup has had some links to cancer. And so by and large in the US and Europe, the Roundup is not sold anymore. It's been pulled from the shelves. But in other places where there aren't the same regulations around safety and those sorts of things, it's still used, which is how they get away with continuing to use their Roundup Ready soybean.
Yeah.
Speaking of which, one of the more recent lawsuits that Monsanto has been involved in happened in 2019. It was actually a kind of a culmination of things, but in 2019 was the most recent ruling that we could find, but it looks like it should be going to the Brazilian Supreme Court if it hasn't already. But, you know, there was a pandemic, so a lot of stuff got delayed. But in Brazil, in 2019, a Brazilian appeals court ruled unanimously that farmers are not allowed to save and replant seeds from Monsanto's Roundup Ready soybeans. So Monsanto genetically modified a type of soybean so that it will survive Monsanto's Roundup pesticide and not get killed like the weeds and things and pests. So they genetically modified it and then they sell it to farmers. And typically 2% of the royalties on the sale of these particularly patented soybeans in Brazil go back to Monsanto, which is pretty standard industry practice. But then Monsanto in Brazil also receives 3% of farmers' sales when the sales are from the plants grown from these patented soybeans. So that is not typical, and it gets caught up in intellectual property rights and copyright law. And that we got into a little bit in our episode last week, which most of that you can find on our Patreon episode because last week's episode was just so prolific. But so that's part of this whole lawsuit. And there was a petition from the farmers' unions in Brazil that began in 2009 that was criticizing this royalty system for the ways that it extended Monsanto's intellectual property rights around seed genetics to the farmers' own production, right? It is, yes, the seeds, but the farmers are the ones who grow the seeds, who water, who do all of that. And so it violates the rights to freely save and replant seeds, which are protected by Brazil's Plant Variety Protection Act. And so in 2012, the civil court initially agreed with the farmers that Monsanto could not prevent them from saving and replanting seeds. But then Monsanto appealed and won, and then the farmers appealed and lost. And so now it's likely to go to the Supreme Court. The other challenge that Monsanto is facing from Brazilian farmers in particular, is on second generation Roundup Ready soybeans, as well as in India, an insect resistant strain of cotton. So there are some particular things that are like kind of digging into that intellectual property right and copyright law. And it's just like Monsanto is just so big that it is hard. And the court systems these days, as we know from, the last couple of weeks in the United States and then in other countries as well, just are not just the way that they should be. And so more and more, while Monsanto might not be a monopoly in terms of like big ag, like there's a lot of big ag companies, it increasingly feels like they are a vertical monopoly where they control the seeds, the genes, and genetic modification stuff, the agricultural productivity, the pesticides and agrochemicals, all of that, where if you buy one, you have to have all of them, that sort of a thing. So Monsanto, for example, owns DeKalb for maize and corn and Seminis for vegetables as like the biggest producers of those particular seeds. What I think is interesting is that in 2018, Monsanto was bought by Bayer, and they're actually, because Monsanto is so well known and has so much negative publicity, they're actually trying to get rid of the Monsanto name and just do like Bayer and then have DeKalb and Seminis and those sorts of things underneath it, which I think is interesting and not totally above board because they're not getting rid of the practices of Monsanto. They're just getting rid of the name. No. And Monsanto and a lot of big ag companies fund university programs. So there's a lot of research that happens at a university level, and it's always really important to look at who is funding that research and who is funding the like agricultural programs at universities, because that influences what is researched and how it's researched. So just as a like heads up if you're looking at research.
Yeah. Speaking of research, you may be asking yourselves, how did Emily and I learn all this? Well, some of it was research we did on our own. And some of it is just the fact that both of us have spent a decent amount of time living in rural areas, and you pick stuff up when you talk to people or when you listen to other people talking to each other. But also, personally speaking, I picked up a decent amount of the stuff from someone called Dr. Sarah Tabor, who has a Twitter account. And I don't know that ironic is the right word for it, but the unfortunate thing about this is that in the time since, I learned a decent amount of this stuff from Dr. Sarah Tabor, which would include that website that lets you go look up your neighbors for the farming subsidies stuff. It has turned out that she has done a fair amount of plagiarism, specifically from smaller agricultural accounts on Twitter. She would steal information from them and present it as her own research. And we can share a link on Twitter to someone who has rounded up some of the information about that. That was accidental, actually.
I know. That's what made it so great.
Sure. So I will say, in my experience, and I have not been following Dr. Sarah Tabor on Twitter for like the last 2 years now since I learned this plagiarism information, the stuff that I have found on her Twitter has been fairly accurate. That doesn't mean that she's getting that information in an ethical fashion. I also don't actually know what she's up to these days because, like I said, I haven't followed her in 2 years. But I have previously gotten useful information there.
Yeah. And, believe it or not, agriculture shows up in pop culture in a variety of ways.
Yes. So there are 2 episodes from the TV show Leverage. The first one, not Leverage Redemption, that directly address agriculture, big ag in particular. The first one is the episode from season 3, episode 5, called The Inside Job. In this one, the team breaks into a major agricultural biotech firm to rescue Parker, who is trying to beat the best security system in the world because she has goals. And in the process, while they're doing that, they discover a dangerous scheme by a major executive, and that leads to all kinds of hijinks, as you might expect from a Leverage episode. And the other episode is called The Hot Potato Job, and this one is season 4, episode 5. And in this one, the team kind of borrows a group of elementary school students who are set to tour a big ag business because they want to get back a seed potato stolen for profit from a small-time crop scientist who wanted to give that potato, which had been formulated to have like a whole new set of nutrients and vitamins and stuff, to the world for free to reduce famines. And so therefore various potato-related hijinks ensue, and it's a good time.
Nice. Luther College is a Paideia class, so all the first years have to take it. And we were supposed to read Giants in the Earth, which is a ginormous book. So yes. I, of course...
My husband read it in high school and says it's excellent.
Okay, so I, of course, read like a page because it was too big and I was overwhelmed. And so I just didn't do any of it. Like, it happens. But part of what Giants in the Earth talks about is some of the initial... particularly Norwegian and Scandinavian immigrants who came over and were growing wheat. And I will take Rory's word for it being really good. I don't think they like really assigned us bad stuff. I just couldn't read it. But also one of the things that happens is they plant the crops and then there's a late freeze and they actually discover that like this particular strain of wheat like benefits from a late frost. So I thought that was interesting because that gets at that. It is not in like big ag terms, but it does impact agriculture in the Midwest a lot.
Yeah.
And then my favorite is the West Wing episode 20 Hours in LA from season 1, episode 16, where Leo is trying to get Vice President Hoynes to break a tie in the Senate that they're predicting around the use of ethanol. And that was actually one of the things that he was one of the only people to campaign against ethanol in Iowa, which for those of us who are familiar with Iowa is like a big deal. But he had a really important, valuable reasons to not value ethanol, even though it was not a popular position. And so that's part of like the flashbacks in this episode because Leo McGarry is trying to get him to break a tie. And I will not spoil how that turns out for you all, but I really liked that episode. I thought it was great.
Yeah. Also a lot of good conversation about what the role of the vice president actually is, if I remember.
Yes. Yeah, because it's like one of the main things that the vice president is supposed to do is tie breaking. So we've got readings for this episode too. Our first reading is Isaiah chapter 44, verses 6 through 8. The prophet Isaiah tells us that God is the only God and we do not need to be afraid. So one of the themes in this passage is the idea of God being the only one, the one and only God, just like the one and only Spider-Man, except for all of the other spider people spread across the Spider-Verse, which if you have seen the Miles Morales Spider-Man movies, you will get, and it is delightful.
Also, definitely a better example than There Can Be Only One from Highlander, because that definitely involves a lot of people chopping each other's heads off. So,
yeah.
Not how the whole gods thing works. No.
That seems like suboptimal. Yeah.
Right.
And then in the second half of verse 6, we read God's words, I am the first and I am the last. Besides me, there is no God. And this is a great example of a merism. I talk about them a lot in Genesis 1 because that's the place where they are used most harmfully, but this is a merism. Also a false binary, right? We think first, last, one or the other. And God says, I am the first and I am the last. So it's kind of like God being the tortoise and the hare.
Sure. I also feel a need to clarify the fact that it's not that God isn't saying that there are no gods like to one side or the other of me because I have eaten them all. God is saying there just are no other gods. Like after the Highlander comment, I felt it necessary to,
Murder bad.
Yeah, murder bad. And then, as our listeners may have noticed, there are only 3 verses in this reading, and so we have chopped them up a bit so that we don't step on each other's toes.
You're welcome.
Yes, because we're getting better at this, maybe.
Or we're not doing it at the exact same time.
Yeah, at least. So in verse 7a, we read, God says, who is like me? Let them proclaim it. Let them declare and set it forth before me. And I'm asking myself, why do I suddenly have Galinda from the musical Wicked singing the song Popular in my head? No, Galinda, there is no one like you either. Like, I realize Elphaba is bright green and you don't have that going for you, but you are also a special and unique snowflake. This just seems like another one of those things that only God gets to get away with saying without being horribly arrogant because they're God. Like, there are some things that God gets to say and no one else does. And this is one of them.
That's fair.
Because it would sound weird coming from anyone else.
Yeah, that's fair.
And then in verse 8a, we read, "Do not fear or be afraid. Have I not told you from of old and declared it? You are my witnesses." Again, God's the one speaking. And this verse very much brings to mind the computer Deep Thought, which was the greatest computer ever built in the history of the universe of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy by Douglas Adams, except for one, which was eventually able, after thousands of years of work, to discover the answer to the great question of life, the universe, and everything, which may be familiar to those of you who have heard any of our episodes with guests, because we like to ask them that question. But while Deep Thought could come up with the answer to the question, it was eventually realized after Deep Thought did that they needed to figure out what the question was. And so Deep Thought had to design the greatest of all computers to do that. And a decent chunk of the story of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy explores that whole process.
Yeah. Yep. And in the second half of verse 8, we read, "Is there any God besides me? There is no other rock. I know not one." And clearly Isaiah, is quoting God at this point, has not seen Moana or the new Jumanji movies and is not a fan of professional wrestling because The Rock is real and definitely not God. I mean, Maui's like a demigod, but still.
Sure. Oh, now I'm imagining the fight between Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson and Peter "The Rock" the disciple. But
I thought you were going to say, and Maui, and I was going to be like, that would be fascinating.
I mean, that would be awkward,
yeah.
But sure. I mean, Maui might be a little irritated about how he was presented in that movie. You never know. And then our second reading for this episode is from Romans chapter 8, verses 12 through 25. Paul explains, "We are children of God and heirs of God, and we will be freed from our sinfulness into the glorious liberty of God's children."
So one of the themes for this passage is the idea of creation and humanity being bound up together. The liberation of creation is bound up in the liberation of humanity and vice versa. And it reminded me of Firefly and the ways that the start of Firefly is all about how creation is used up on Earth, and so they spread across the galaxy, terraforming and creating a creation out of what is already there, but like creating a livable creation and continuing that binding together of creation and humanity because we are a part of it.
Yep. And then in verse 17a, we read, "And if children, then heirs, heirs of God and joint heirs with Christ." Also known as the one inheritance that we can receive while absolutely not worrying about legal entanglements from people trying to mess with the will.
Oh, yeah.
Maybe I've been reading too many family melodrama stories on Reddit, but this is the kind of inheritance that does not bring out the absolute worst in literally everyone. And this is something to be celebrated. Like, we should enjoy this moment. That's what I tend to think about when I read that verse.
Truth. Yeah.
And then verse 21, that the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to decay and will obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God.
I'm glad you did this one because otherwise I was going to be really disappointed in you.
Yeah, no, absolutely. This is my favorite verse in the Bible. Only this is actually one of the very rare verses where I prefer the KJV translation for it, which does not happen a lot.
Yeah.
But I think that it gets the spirit of what Paul is going for better in the KJV. Because in that one, he's not talking about the freedom of the glory of the children of God. He's talking about the glorious liberty of the children of God. And that is much more descriptive and easy to imagine, I think. I think Anne Shirley from the Anne of Green Gables books would call it scope for imagination. And I think an accurate translation doesn't have to be without poetry to be right. And so I think the KJV got that particular phrase as a better translation. But that is an incredibly rare thing, so don't expect me to say that a lot.
There's I think First Peter, there's a verse that talks about Christians, and the KJV talks about Christians as a peculiar people. So I frequently use that when people are like uncomfortable with the word queer. I'm like, it means peculiar.
Sure.
And this is what we have from First Peter about Christians being a peculiar people. So what does that mean for us?
Sure.
But yeah, I don't take the KJV a lot, but I do occasionally. It has a certain poetry to it sometimes.
Yeah, it's an interesting piece of English literature.
Yeah. And then in verse 23, we read, "And not only the creation, but we ourselves who have the first fruits of the Spirit groan inwardly while we wait for adoption, the redemption of our bodies." And this is like talking about creation groaning in labor pains. And so then it's like continuation of Paul to groan inwardly. And I just gotta say, I don't know anyone who was pregnant or in labor and groaned inwardly. I'm just saying, like, groan, yes. Inwardly, no. And maybe...
So,
yeah.
So interestingly, the method of trying to keep me from getting pregnant as a teenager that my parents chose was to inform me of some of the weird things that people do around childbirth, and also lots of the horrible options that can, things that can happen to you.
Mm-hmm.
But there is a movement that originated in a specific culture and then got adopted by a lot of, frankly, white crunchy moms in America. Which was the movement for a silent birth. Not just the person pushing the baby out, but also the rest of the room. And this, like I said, originally came from a particular culture where the idea was you weren't like adding extra stress to the baby by, having a lot of people yelling, which that part kind of makes sense, but it got completely removed from the culture and turned into this whole different thing about like being the perfect parent. And there's a lot of stuff around childbirth that people choose to turn into like moral judgments that just get the baby out, everybody gets to live, and then feed the baby, and that's really what matters. Yeah. So don't listen to those judgy people.
Yeah, that's weird. And I mean, I was thinking that maybe Paul should try those things that there are videos that go around every once in a while of like cisgender men trying these like things that stimulate contractions and seeing how long they can last. Yes. And they can never last very long. So I think like Paul should maybe try that out and try out what it feels like and groan inwardly.
A TENS unit, I think they're called.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, a TENS unit.
Or I'm not really a big fan of the concept of reincarnation, but are there some cisgender men who I would really love to have reincarnated as a cisgender woman at some point so that they have the chance to go through childbirth that I've known? Well, maybe a few. Not, a lot, but a few.
That's fair. And then in verse 25 we read, "But if we hope for what we do not see, we wait for it with patience." Or, as an alternative to waiting with patience, we work a whole bunch to bring it about through the rebellion, risking a lot for this new hope.
Sure. And you might be working with patience too. I hear she's nice.
I mean, now we're really crossing between Star Wars and Firefly. I did have that thought because I'm rewatching Firefly right now. And so I was like, Patience, I know her.
Well, that Patience is not especially nice, but she tends to shoot at people.
Yeah.
But
yeah. And then our gospel reading for this episode is Matthew chapter 13, verses 24 through 30 and 36 through 43. Jesus tells a parable about wheat and weeds and explains it to the disciples. So one of the themes in this passage is the idea of weeding, of getting rid of weeds and things that do not cultivate growth in the desired plants. And it reminded me of Barbara Kingsolver's Animal Vegetable Miracle, 1 year of seasonal eating, in which her family only ate locally for a year. And at one point they go on a family trip to visit friends who are Amish farmers, and the farmer is showing them the difference. Like, they have a plot of land that they've always grown stuff organically on, and a plot of land that they bought from somebody who used pesticides and stuff, and then since then have like converted it to organic growth. But looking at the two plots of the crops side by side, the organic one that uses natural predators and pests and that sort of thing is growing better than the one that is also organic but previously had been like chemical pesticides and stuff had been used on that land. So I just think that that's always interesting, and that's part of what we were talking about before on like high yields and those sorts of things, and what chemical pesticides versus natural pesticides or organic or predators, how that impacts the growth of plants and crops.
Yeah. And so as we jump into the verses, in verse 25, we read, "But while everybody was asleep, an enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and then went away." Okay, I'm trying to imagine doing this at night in the ancient world. So you have to walk through the field with a stick and a bag of weed seeds, right? You poke a hole, you drop in a few weed seeds, and then you close up the hole and you repeat. And in the ancient world, you'd be in a kind of true dark that it is almost impossible for us to experience now without any electric light in the entire world. And I guess I have to assume that if you're doing this kind of thing, it must have been a full moon that night, right? Because if you're going to plant a whole field worth of weeds without breaking your neck in that kind of darkness, you would need the moon to be out.
Yeah.
And imagine for a minute how angry you would have to be to do this to someone. Like, this is an immense amount of work that could absolutely, get you accidentally killed, let alone have someone discover what you're doing and get angry with you about it. This is not Hulk-like anger. This is calmly planning the complete destruction of your enemies kind of anger.
This is like Monsanto-style anger.
Yeah, this is amazing. So probably it wasn't an enemy. Probably this was just a field that hadn't been properly prepped, and therefore there were weeds. But sure, if the servants want to go with that version because they were the ones that didn't do the prep work, that's an option. And then in verse 30, we read, "Let both of them grow together until the harvest, and at harvest time I will tell the reapers, collect the weeds first, and bind them in bundles to be burned, but gather the wheat into my barn." So for those who are not familiar with ancient farming, a reaper was a person who went and harvested a crop, any crop. And here we're talking about grain. And they were not necessarily a death omen. Like, not all reapers back then were death omens. That's not how this worked. Or even very grim at all. That came later. The reason why a grim reaper, a personification of death, carries a scythe, however, is because this is where the word reaper comes from. If death reaps souls or reaps lives, a reaper would walk into the grain field, gather a few stalks of, say, wheat in your hand, and then you'd cut off the bottom of the stalk with a scythe to harvest it in the days before modern farm equipment. The difficulty of doing this without chopping off your own leg with the scythe is kind of remarkable. There's a skill to it. This is skilled labor in a big way.
All labor is skilled
labor. But if you
labor.
would like to, well, sorry. Yes.
I had to.
But
we're on
don't chop off your legs.
We're on hot strike summer or whatever the popular term is.
Sure.
So,
but don't play with scythes if you don't have experience with them. Don't chop off your legs or any other body parts. And if you would like to read some stories from Death's point of view, there are a few in the Discworld series by Terry Pratchett. One of my favorite books from that is Hogfather, which is not the first book about death or from his perspective, but it does give you a great sense of who he is and what he's about.
I really like The Book Thief also, which is told from the perspective of death. So,
interesting.
Throw that one out.
But not Terry Pratchett's death.
No.
Yes.
Just like
Terry Pratchett's
small
death
d
is
death.
a returning character.
Okay. Yeah. Different death.
He has a horse named Binky.
There's also in the Graceling series, in Bitter Blue, is where the person first comes up. There's a character named Death, but it is spelled death. And so when people want to annoy him...
I think that's the British thing.
When people want to annoy him, though, then they pronounce it death.
Nice.
He gets annoyed. Anyway. Then in verse 38, as Jesus is supposedly explaining this to the disciples, or Matthew is giving us Matthew's interpretation, I don't know, you pick. We read, "The field is the world, and the good seed are the children of the rain. The weeds are the children of the evil one." And first off, the explanations, there are 50 different explanations that give different meanings in this little paragraph. So it was it's not this clear as it seems. But also this definitely gives me the impression of double predestination, right? Where we have a lot of folks talk about predestination, and something might be like Buffy, who is destined to become a slayer. But then it raises the question of destiny towards an evil one in Buffy. Are evil people destined to be evil? And also, how do you tell? That's the thing that always comes down to it for me for double predestination. How do you tell who is who? Because you know that you're going to start deciding who is who, and you're going to be deciding it based on your prejudices, not necessarily based on fact or accuracy. And also, I don't believe in double predestination, so that's part of it.
Yeah.
But yeah. And then in verse 41, we read, "The human one will send the angels, and they will collect out of the rain all causes of sin and all evildoers." So that, I was like, okay, you're gathering all the causes of sin, like greed and racism and capitalism and exploitation and evildoers. like Monsanto? That's what I've got for that one. But yeah, there's like a point where I'm like, oh, you're actually getting at the root causes, but then also the evildoers. But are they evildoers if we get rid of the root causes? What's the order we're doing?
Yeah.
So many different questions. It's almost like parables are meant to provoke conversation. Spoilers.
Hey, now, we're getting to that next week.
Spoilers, sweetie. Okay, sorry.
And now for our most pesticide-free segment. Let's make a Muppets musical. In that I don't believe we've ever mentioned pesticides during this segment before.
Not until now.
Right. Emily, do you have any castings for Muppets that you would like to share from our readings or related to Big Ag?
So the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago, I love, and went there multiple times when I was in seminary. And one of the exhibits that they have is one connected more towards agriculture, and so you can climb into some of, I don't remember what vehicle it is, but it is farm equipment, and the big wheel is like as big as an adult me, and you can climb all over it and stuff. And so that is like giving me major like Elmo Sesame Street vibes of like, let's go check out the farm equipment and learn about farming on Sesame Street. So
absolutely.
That's where my mind is going.
Mr. Rogers also actually may have done an episode like that. I don't remember. From Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood.
Mm-hmm.
So I was trying to think of different options, and I admit that all of the Muppets would be terrible at going into someone's field and trying to plant weeds in it at night. Like that is not what they are built for. They are not sneaky. And so I was instead trying to come up with something for the second reading. And,
I mean, they could guard the field. Miss Piggy could guard the field.
These are Muppets. Sure, but none of them are exactly good at like focusing on one thing.
That's fair.
I'm not saying they all have ADHD, but they are easily distractible people.
Fair.
But I was thinking about the second reading, and in terms of illustrating the glorious liberty of the children of God, I think Animal is a delightful example. Animal is all about glorious liberty, and if that glorious liberty happens to include a percussion section, all the better.
Mm-hmm.
So,
thanks for joining us. Catch us next time when we'll discuss nerdery connections to the scripture readings for the 9th Sunday after Pentecost with our special guest, Dr. Amy Jill Levine, who we are ridiculously excited about, and we already recorded the episode, so we can guarantee you that it is phenomenal, and if you're not a Patreon supporter now, you really want to be.
Amazing.
Mm-hmm, for real. This podcast has been produced by us, Emily Ewing and Kay Rohloff. For more fun, check us out on Twitter and Facebook at Nerds at Church, or contact us at nerdsatchurch@gmail.com.
Also, if you like what you've heard, rate us or leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Facebook, or wherever you catch your podcasts. If you want access to our uncut guest episodes and interviews, live Q&As, and more, support us on Patreon at patreon.com/nerdsatchurch. It's cheaper than getting into bed with Monsanto in any way, shape, or form.
Truth. So much truth. Also, let us know on Facebook or Twitter who you would cast for Let's Make a Muppets musical for this episode.
As the ancient Christians said,
Pax Vobiscum.